All right, eighth grade. I am coming to you from my house in Chino Hills right now, not too far from my dear neighbor Christina's house. So, hey, Christina. Um, Today we're going to be doing a lesson on Chapter 6, Section 4. This is Indian removal. So, the removal of Native Americans from their traditional lands out west. And so, this is a major part of Andrew Jackson's legacy, and part of why Andrew Jackson's legacy is so complicated. So, in the last section, Section 3, we learned why Andrew Jackson was very popular among Americans, things that made him a successful president, right? He was a big supporter of expanding suffrage, that means the right to vote, to any white male who was a U.S. citizen. You did not have to have an education, you did not have to own property. He believed that more Americans should have the right to vote. Right? Andrew Jackson was also largely a self-made man. Right? He raised himself um, basically in the wilderness from the age of 14 on. He survived smallpox as a child. He'd been shot several times. There's a story of him getting mauled by a bear and surviving. So a lot of Americans had a lot of respect for Andrew Jackson. He was also a very successful military leader. He moved up the ranks of the military and led a lot of successful military expeditions and was victorious in a lot of battles against Native Americans in the South, against Seminole tribes, for example, members of Seminole tribes who had been very aggressive against farmers and settlers and towns in the southeastern part of the United States. So he's very, very well respected by Americans. And then remember, in the election of 1824, a lot of Americans thought he got robbed, right? Because he won the most of the popular vote, he won the most out of all the candidates in the Electoral College, but because he didn't win a majority, the um, the the House of Representatives got to decide who the next president was. And Henry Clay, who was the Speaker of the House of Representatives, told all of his supporters to vote for Andrew Jackson's major opponent in the election, John Quincy Adams. So John Quincy Adams becomes president, Andrew Jackson does not. And so people felt that Andrew Jackson got robbed. All right. Well, in section 4, we're going to talk about the impact Andrew Jackson had on Native Americans. Right. So we're starting on slide 24 here. Andrew Jackson was a person who had a lot of enemies, not just in American politics, but in North America, right? So he didn't like Whigs. Remember, Whigs are the political party that arose in the wake of John Quincy Adams' failure, right? A lot of John Quincy Adams supporters who were Republicans, who were anti-Andrew Jackson, formed a party called the Whigs. So the Whig Party was his major political opponent. He hated Henry Clay. He hated the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court was still full of a bunch of guys like Chief Justice John Marshall, who were Federalists. He hated Europeans. He hated Canada. He hated people from New England. He hated basically anyone who worked for the federal government. He hated banks. He hated basically everyone who he ever met in American politics. However, more than any of these groups of people, the people Andrew Jackson hated the most were African Americans and Native American tribes, because he was, by most historical accounts, quite racist. And so his treatment of these groups is, for better or worse, what he is most known for. All right, so before Andrew Jackson became president, a lot of Native American tribes, specifically the Cherokee, had westernized. What does that mean? That means they took on aspects of Western culture, right? So they adopted European practices and beliefs, like they started sending their children to schools, they learned to read and write, they ran businesses, they published newspapers. The Cherokee tribe even had its own government and constitution. A lot of natives had also converted to Christianity. Something else that's not on the slides is a lot of Native Americans had married uh, settlers in the Western lands. A lot of them had married slaves, right? So the lines between Native American and American was starting to get blurred. Okay, so by the time Andrew Jackson is president, there are 100,000 Native Americans living east of the Mississippi River. Now, before Andrew Jackson was president, uh, during the War of 1812, when it was clear that the British were basically going to abandon the Native Americans and leave them to defend themselves, a lot of Native American tribes signed treaties saying that they gave up claims to all of their territory east of the Mississippi River, right? So in the Northwest Territory, for example, like after Tecumseh died, a lot of Native Americans moved west of the Mississippi River. Well, this was not true in the Southeast. So in the South, east of the Mississippi River, we still had a lot of Native American tribes who wanted to stay there. The Cherokee tribe, the Choctaw tribe, the Seminole tribe, the Creek tribe, those were all still very present in the South. And a lot of Americans thought, well, wait a second, I thought Native Americans signed a bunch of treaties that said they have to get out, right? And to a certain extent, that might be true, right? So there were representatives from a lot of these tribes in the central and northern part of of the country that was east of the Mississippi River that signed treaties saying on behalf of the Seminole tribe, on behalf of the Choctaw tribe, we promise to leave. But these people that signed the treaties didn't really have authority over members of these tribes that lived in the South. So members of the tribes that lived in the South refused to get out because they said the treaties don't apply to us. And this is going to be especially relevant with the Cherokee tribe, which we'll get to on the next slide. So the United States government sees the natives' presence in the Southeast as a roadblock to American growth, right? Mostly because they are living on arable farmland that a lot of white Southerners want to use to turn into plantations to develop the Southern economy, right? Another reason, though, is because these Native Americans were not American citizens, right? They were part of their own sovereign nations, right? So they were not American citizens, and the U.S. federal government recognized them as other nations living within U.S. territory. So they couldn't become U.S. citizens. And so they had this weird status in American life where they're allowed to be there because of these treaties that were signed in the early 1800s, even before the War of 1812. Um, but they don't have to pay taxes. They don't have to, they're not voting. They're not going to serve in the military. They're just kind of living on the land because it is their traditional ancestral land. And these treaties from decades ago say they get to live there, right? Well, a lot of white Southerners thought that the War of 1812 treaties kind of overrode these previous treaties, nullified them. But the Native Americans did not see it that way. And so a lot of Cherokee and Choctaw and Creek and Seminole tribes members refused to leave. Right? Well, this comes to a head in the years 1825 and 1827 in the state of Georgia. Georgia passes laws that say Native Americans have to leave. Right? And in 1828, Georgia passes a law against the Cherokee Nation, specifically targeting the Cherokee Nation, saying, Cherokee Nation, you guys have to leave, and all of these treaties that used to exist between you and the federal government, they no longer apply because we, the state of Georgia, are overriding these treaties. We do not recognize your authority to be here. Right? So this is going to lead to some action by the Supreme Court. The Cherokee Nation doesn't want to leave Georgia. They say the treaties from the early 1800s, even going all the way back before Thomas Jefferson, allow them to stay, and that this 1828 Georgia law violates the Constitution, right? Because the Constitution says treaties are the supreme law of the land. So treaties should override, treaties should be more powerful than state laws, right? So the Georgia is saying that their law overrides the treaties, and the Cherokee are saying the treaties override the Georgia law. Right. Additionally, further complicating this is some of the treaties after the War of 1812 allowed Cherokee to stay in specific places in the South, right? So that got mixed into it as well, right? So Georgia's basically saying none of these treaties matter. Georgia law is supreme inside of Georgia. Cherokee, you got to get out of Georgia regardless what the treaties say. And the Cherokee are saying, nope, the treaties say we get to stay, so Georgia law doesn't apply. So the Supreme Court takes up this case. And actually, the first time they take up this case, the Cherokee lose, and it looks like they're going to have to leave. But then right away, they take up another case called Worcester v. Georgia in 1832. And the question in this case is whether or not Georgia law has the power to override treaties. So our treaties made with the federal government that recognize the Cherokee Nation as a separate nation, as a legitimate nation of it unto itself, do those take precedence, or does the Georgia law take precedence? And the court says the treaties with the Cherokee are the law of the land, right? So these treaties with the Cherokee are federal law. Federal law overrides state law. So when federal law and state law conflict with each other, federal law wins. So in other words, they're saying Georgia does not have the power to pass a law that violates these treaties. Andrew Jackson, however, he's president at this time. Remember, this is 1832. Andrew Jackson makes it clear that he doesn't care what the Supreme Court says. Right? So Andrew Jackson says, John Marshall, that's the justice of the Supreme Court, John Marshall has made his decision. Now let him enforce it. And of course, from our knowledge of the Constitution, we know the Supreme Court does not have the power to execute laws, right? So Andrew Jackson is basically saying, I'm going to ignore what the Supreme Court says, right? I personally, as president, am going to support the state of Georgia and their law saying the Cherokee have to leave over what the Supreme Court says, right? So that's what's going on. Oh, there goes my dog. Holly, stop barking. Holly, you are interrupting class. Holly, chill out. Calm down. Holly, come here. Hey. She's not listening to me, just like you guys. This is what it's like when I'm teaching a class and you guys won't stop talking. Holly, come here. Sit. Thank you. Here, you can see my dog. There she is. Oh, Holly, hey, come here. All right. So Andrew Jackson ignores the court's ruling and enforces another law that Congress passes called the Indian Removal Act, which essentially gives the president, the executive branch, the authority to give Native Americans land west of the Mississippi in the Oklahoma Territory. My neighbor's walking by. In the Oklahoma Territory, and saying to the Native Americans, you guys have to move there. So a lot of Native Americans in the South see the writing on the wall. They realize that they're probably going to be forced off their land sooner or later. So they figure they might as well take this deal where at least they get some land in Oklahoma to live on. Whereas if they get forced off their land, a lot of Native Americans might be killed and they might not get any land west of the Mississippi at all. So they say, all right, we're going to take this deal. So a lot of Native Americans sign treaties and move west. However, the Choctaw tribe, the Seminole tribe, and the Cherokee tribe are resistant to this. Um, and as a result, during the presidency of